The Canadian Rockies are way better than the American Rockies. At least that seems to be a pretty common sentiment online. Obviously, this is very subjective, but let's compare the two ranges to see why this is such a popular take. Starting with elevation, it's absolutely no competition, as the Rocky Mountains in the United States are substantially higher than the Rocky Mountains in Canada. The highest point in the American Rockies is Mount Elbert, which has an elevation of 14,440 feet, making it nearly 1,500 feet higher than the highest point in the Canadian Rockies, Mount Robson, which has an elevation of 12,972 feet. But taking the comparison one step further, the American Rockies have nearly 700 peaks above 13,000 feet in elevation, while the Canadian Rockies have exactly zero. But height isn't everything, as the American Rockies tend to have a much higher base elevation than their Canadian counterparts, suggesting that prominence and jut would be better metrics for a fair comparison. And looking at these metrics, they tell a totally different story than elevation. That's because, despite having none of the 700 highest peaks in the Rocky Mountains, Canada is home to the most prominent mountain in the range, Mount Robson. Located in British Columbia, Mount Robson has 9,281 feet of prominence, making it nearly 200 feet more prominent than the most prominent mountain in the American Rockies, Mount Elbert. But beyond just Mount Robson, the most prominent mountains in the Canadian Rockies tend to be more prominent than the most prominent mountains in the American Rockies across the board. Additionally, the Canadian Rockies also tend to have more jut than the American Rockies. If you aren't familiar, jut is a measure of how high and how steep a mountain rises above its surrounding landscape, and it effectively quantifies how impressive a mountain looks. As we can see on this map, the Canadian Rockies tend to have more jut, indicated by warmer colors, than the American Rockies to the south. And then finally, there's the subjective visual comparison between the two ranges. In general, the American Rockies tend to be more gentle and rounded than the Canadian Rockies, which tend to be more rugged and dramatic. Now, of course, the American Rockies do have some truly beautiful mountains, such as the Grand Teton, but it does seem like your average mountain in the American Rockies is less impressive than your average mountain in the Canadian Rockies. That's due in large part to differences in geology and glacial history. Given all of this, I tend to agree that the Canadian Rockies are better than the American Rockies. But let me know what you think in the comments and follow for more geography content.